Grip here. Today I want to talk about something that maybe not a lot of you will take into consideration, and that is the FOC of your arrow. I was hanging out before we were all quarantined. I was hanging out at the archery shop with the kids in my high school archery club, and the shop owner and I were talking about different arrow setups that we've used in the past, and we were mentioning the FOC of different arrows that we've had. And that's when one of the young ladies in the archery club called me over and said, "Hey, heard you talking, what's the FOC?" And it kind of dawned on me, maybe not everybody knows this, so maybe some of you out there are unsure what the FOC is, so today I want to talk a little bit about that. So your FOC stands for front of center, and what that is measuring is the distance or the percentage of the arrow shaft. The fulcrum or the balance point is in front of the center of the arrow. FOC, front of center. So where the balance point is in front of the center of the arrow, and depending on the FOC that your arrow has, it can make a difference in a couple different things. It can help with its flight characteristics, with its trajectory. It can help the arrow in penetration for a hunting arrow, or conversely, it can make that arrow deflect easier, again depending on the FOC. So let's talk a little bit about that. So how do you find the FOC? So just happen to have one of my 3D arrows here, and what you do is you measure the full length of the arrow, so from the back of the nock to the very tip of your point. So if you have one of those long broadheads, a long expandable, or one of those heavy cut on contact along some of those long steel force broadheads, or your Zwickis or Magnus, some of those broadheads, you go from the tip of that head. So if it's a hunting arrow, you want to measure this with the broadhead installed. So what you do is you find the full length of the arrow. So let's say, for math purposes, we'll make this easy, say this is a 30-inch arrow. All right, so the midpoint of this arrow would be 15 inches. So we then set this arrow and we balance it, and we try to find its balance point, which should be in front of where the center of the arrow is, and we mark that. And so now we have the center of the arrow marked, we have the balance of the arrow marked, and so let's say, again for math purposes, that the difference is 3 inches. So this is 12 inches from the tip of the arrow, and this is 15 inches is the middle, so the balance point is at 12 inches. The center of the arrow is 15. That's a difference of 3 inches. Out of a 30-inch arrow, we divide the difference, 3 inches, by the 30 inches of the full arrow. That gives us an FOC of 10%. Okay? So that's a quick example of how it's done. So let's take a step into the workroom, and we'll walk through how I actually set it up and find the FOC of an arrow. Okay, so here we are in the workroom, and we'll walk through how I will find the FOC of this 3D arrow. So I'll try to switch the camera angle so that you can see my hands here and see what we're doing. All right. So hopefully we can see everything that's going on here. What we're going to do now is we're going to find the FOC of this arrow, this 3D arrow right here. I have my meter stick, and I know it's upside down for you guys. I guess I could hold it this way. I don't know if you can read the numbers or not, but that might be helpful. So I use a meter stick because I'm just a simple anatomy teacher. I am not a math teacher, and I prefer to work in decimals than I do fractions. So that's why I use the meter stick. So we're going to measure the full length of this arrow first, from the back of the nock all the way to the tip of the arrow. And now I know I'm looking at my numbers backwards, but that looks to be right at 69.5 centimeters. So we'll write that down over here on my little piece of paper. So we have 69.5 centimeters. We're going to divide that in half, and as I said, I'm not a math teacher, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my old calculator here, and we go 69.5 divided by 2 should give us 34.75 is the halfway point. So 34.75, that's going to mark it 34.75, that's going to mark it about right there. This is our halfway point, so I'll mark that. All right, and now we're going to find its balance point. So a couple different ways you can do this. I've taken up my old pocket knife here. This is a knife I use to strip veins and feathers off. We can set the blade and give that a quick little balance right there, almost there, right about there. The other thing I do is, if you can see my arrow spinner here that I use, just obviously as its name would imply, to spin arrows, I can slide this over and just use one of the rollers and balance on one of the rollers and find that spot. And that's going to be right there. We'll mark it. And then now we will go and measure that distance. And that distance is going to be, slide this down here. That distance is going to be from the 10, there's the mark, to, it is about 6.5. So 6.5, let's go to the calculator here. So we go 6.5 divided by a total arrow length of 69.5, and that gives us an FOC of 0.093 times 5 times 100 will give us the percentage, so that would be a 9.35. We round that up to 9.4%, and that's pretty good. Alright, so that's how you find the FOC of your arrow. Now that you know how to find the FOC of your arrow, the big question is, what can you do with this information? And I'm going to tell you, opinions will vary on what the quote-unquote best FOC is for your arrow. In my opinion, that's all going to depend on what you want to do with that arrow. If it's going to be a 3D arrow, then you're thinking more trajectory, flatter trajectory than you are anything else. So you are probably going to want to squeeze that FOC down a little tighter than if you were setting up a hunting arrow. A hunting arrow, you want that arrow to penetrate. So a larger FOC, more weight out on the front end, that arrow will penetrate better than an arrow that has a very small FOC and has more, comparatively, than more weight on the back end of the arrow. They deflect more. So weight up on the front has a tendency to, you get all that weight on the front when that arrow starts to go in. If it hits something, it will deflect less. And if it hits bone, it'll have a tendency to want to drive through the bone. If the weight is back further, closer to the middle, that arrow will want to deflect a little bit more. So those are all things to consider when setting up your arrow. I know people for 3D arrows that they use that deflection when they set that idea of having an arrow that won't deflect when they set their arrow up. So they want a fairly large FOC. Other people want the FOC to be smaller so they can get a flatter trajectory. So I personally like to have mine around 9 to 8%. I've talked to guys that have had 6%, and to me that's pushing the envelope a little bit, but if it works for them. I've also talked to other guys that want a heavier FOC, so when they hit other arrows in the 11 or the 12 ring, their arrow has a tendency to deflect less and it won't kick them out of those rings. So there's something to be said for both lines of thought. But again, for a hunting arrow, you're going to want a larger FOC, over 10, 12%, nothing wrong with it. If you're setting an arrow up to hunt whitetail, 10% is going to be just fine. If you're going after thicker skin, tougher, dangerous game, if you're headed to Africa and going after the big 5, you're going to want a lot of weight up front. You're going to want penetration. So you're going to want a heavy broadhead and a big heavy insert, and that's going to give you a very large FOC. that heavy front end arrow will have a tendency to pull the arrow through the animal instead of deflecting. So hopefully now you're comfortable with what the FOC of your arrow is, how to find the FOC, and now you'll be able to use that information to help build the arrow that you want for your particular archery needs. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the deer woods.